I've heard or I've read Canadians saying, we will be the new Saudi Arabia. That's exactly the danger, because as so many nations which have large oil resources know, that oil changes the nation. It brutalizes the nation. A recent study by a German NGO looked at the 60 richest, the 60 biggest economies on Earth, and ranked them according to their contribution to an attempt to strike a new climate change agreement. Saudi Arabia came 60th, Canada came 59th. It's a grim, grim picture. We have seen now a story of systematic sabotage of the meeting starting in Poznan last year, where Canada was awarded Fossil of the Year. In Bangkok this year, almost the entire developing world bloc walked out while the Canadian delegate was speaking because they were so horrified by what he was saying. And in Barcelona, Canada managed to scoop the big prize there of Fossil of the Week. And it's heading for a clean run of another Fossil of the Year, the way things are going. It's a catastrophe, and this is why I'm here. I'm here to add my voice to the very large numbers of Canadian citizens who are pleading with their government to change its policy before they drag the name of this country through the mud, before they do to this country what whaling has done to Japan or what George Bush and Dick Cheney did to the United States. And I've come alongside the Canadian activists and the Canadian NGOs, the kind of people who are in this room today, who are trying to remind their government that it is not speaking for the majority of Canadians. It is not acting in the interests of the majority of Canadians, let alone the interests of the majority of the world's people. And that as we approach the biggest and most significant meeting there has ever been on environmental issues, and probably the most important international summit the world has ever faced, this is a time for statesmanship. It is not a time to pursue particular and peculiar interests. It is not a time to have your policy determined for you by the economic interests, particularly of a very destructive and rapacious industry. This is a time to stand back and see what the wider interests of humanity are, not be dominated by the immediate interests of your own political and economic circle. If we are serious about tackling climate change and preventing more than 2 degrees of warming, which almost all governments on Earth now say they are serious about, we have to decide which reserves we are not going to dig out of the ground. We have to put a total moratorium on all further prospecting for fossil fuel reserves and stop all further prospecting and development of new reserves, in other words, taking any more out of the resource and turning it into reserves which should be ready to go. And this has startling and shocking implications, really. You find that it's completely at odds with the plans of almost all the world's governments. In fact, there's a stark contradiction between the two positions that governments which do have a sensible policy or half-sensible policy on climate change maintain, where on the one hand they say you must reduce your consumption of fossil fuels. At the same time, all the governments on Earth that I can think of, bar one, have a policy of maximizing the supply of fossil fuels. So they're trying to minimize the demand and maximize the supply. This contradiction has to be resolved. And the only way it can sensibly be resolved is, as I say, a decision to invest in the only form of carbon capture and storage which is known to work, is geologically stable, scientifically proven and completely safe, leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Now, this isn't a message that the government of Canada, let alone the government of Alberta, is going to be very keen on. We know that the tar sands are currently being promoted as Canada's economic lifeline, as if this highly developed and highly sophisticated country, this very enterprising nation, didn't have other means of making a living. But of course, this is what the oil curse does. So as soon as you identify that resource as being your economic lifeline, everything else shrivels. Capital is diverted away from other projects. We've already seen how The renewables industry in this country has been starved of cash, and a lot of it poured into the oil patch instead. You find that political attention is diverted away from other aspects of the economy and concentrated on that. And you find that, as I was saying, the political tenor of the nation changes. And in almost all major oil-producing nations, the oil industry effectively recruits a political class to pursue its interests. And in pursuing its interests, that political class has to brutalize the sensibilities of the nation and turn it into a less decent and less civilized place. So if you're the government of Nigeria, it must trample on the heads of the Ogoni. If you're the government of Canada, you must trample on the heads of the First Nations people. If you are the government of Ecuador, you must be prepared to spill oil into one of the most diverse rainforests on Earth. If you're the government of Canada, you must see all sorts of heavy metals and organic compounds flow down the Athabasca River. That is the brutalization process, which can, if it's allowed to let rip, eventually take over the entire character of a nation. We've seen it again and again. It is called the oil curse. And this is what the government of this country appears to want to be the destiny of Canada, of this very beautiful and very sophisticated nation. And I urge you, ladies and gentlemen, to fight it. To fight it not for your own sake, and not just for the sake of the Canadians who are being immediately affected by the devastating pollution and habitat destruction, which we see in Alberta and will see in Saskatchewan as well, but to fight it for the benefit of all the world's people, including those who are already being hammered by the impacts of climate change. Because, of course, one of the great ironies of climate change is that those most responsible for it, largely, by and large, live in temperate regions of the world, like this one. And temperate regions of the world have a climatic resilience that other parts of the world do not have. Now, we know that climate change could destroy the lives of a very large number of the world's people. We know that it threatens the world's supplies of food and water, and that it threatens potentially to exacerbate famine to such an extent that it makes all previous instances look like sideshows at the circus of human suffering. And we know that if we allow this to go ahead, we'll be responsible for it. And who here wants that on his or her conscience? Who here, if you truly look it in the face, could live with that? Only a psychopath. And we must not let the psychopaths take over the asylum. We must not let that tiny number of people who don't care about their impacts on humanity to govern the response of those who do care. We, ladies and gentlemen, are the people who care. Let's make our voices count.